Mr. Speaker, at the height of the space program in the 1960s, 1970s, the whole entire United States was back behind the idea that we could put a man on the moon. And because of that incentive, because of that national unity and nationalism that we were able to put behind that space program, the funding for NASA at that time was skyrocketing, literally. And the funding for the sciences in the nation at that point was skyrocketing. And we believe that we need to return back to that age where we can put and inject into sciences and instill in our children a love for the sciences that we simply do not have today. So I'm going to have one claim for you today, Mr. Speaker, that's going to come out of this speech. This speech, that how this, by putting a man and prioritizing that man to go on Mars over deep space research, will actually really invigorate the scientists and promote national unity under a new foundation of space exploration science. So first of all, let's talk about the problem that I want to address with this model. Well, first let's talk about the model. The model is quite simple. We're going to allocate the mass majority of research and funding at NASA to go into putting a man on Mars versus sending probes into deep space. It's quite simple. That's as easy as it gets. So why is this a problem that we need to address? Well, we believe the problem today is twofold. I'm thinking that I haven't really started saying much. The first thing is that we believe the problem is that funding is getting cut back from all these national space programs and sciences around the United States, right? First of all, Obama just announced a huge cut to NASA in recent years. And second, a lot of the programs that we talked about before during the 1960s, such as space camps for children and actually science missions for children in certain schools, are being cut back. We believe that's really, really bad. The second thing that we want to talk about is that there's not a national energy behind the sciences anymore, right? And actually funding and jobs for people in sciences, such as astronautical engineering, are actually open, but there's no one to fill these jobs. And we believe that's also really bad because that means there's a lack of interest in these jobs and lack of interest in these fields when people go to college to get their PhDs. We believe that's also really bad. We want to address both of them in this speech today. So let's talk about the data behind this a little bit more. We believe that right now, business and computer engineers are being pumped out at colleges at extremely fast rate. We believe this is a problem that dates back to childhood education, right? Because in elementary schools, they're prioritizing stuff as math and writing a lot more and reading over other places. And we believe that's really bad because just because we're being tested, compared around the whole entire world on these certain subjects, we're not putting as much funding into stuff as such as the arts and sciences. We believe that's also really bad because both of these provide extremely extraordinary skills to children later on in life. The second thing is that, like I mentioned before, there's too few workers for these really highly skilled positions. We believe this is the nature of the problem, that people don't see the benefits coming out of getting a PhD and spending 8 years in astronautical engineering. We believe we need to reinvigorate that love for those types of arts. And finally, we believe this just leads to a lack of understanding about our life on Earth. When you don't have people who understand the sciences, will lead to stuff such as global warming, such as all the environmental problems, because people trump business over hard sciences. We believe that's really bad because we're damaging our Earth as a process because no one really understands this problem in a business situation, right? We believe people like Google and Apple don't understand the environment fully enough beyond marketing ploys to simply do something about the environment. We believe these are all problems in society that we need to address. So how does this warrant something to go back into that? And I'd like to talk briefly about the space program that actually took place during the 1960s. After we placed Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon, children around the world, around the United States, looked up to these people as heroes. They wanted to be just like these astronauts. And in fact, they loved going into sciences as a result of that. Space programs at the time for building rockets, the national competition for rocket building amongst middle schools and high schools skyrocketed at that time. We believe those are really beautiful things that benefits these children, right? For multiple reasons. First, it gives them something to do in school, right? Versus the alternative that they just go after school and go home. We believe this gives them incentive to actually learn after school, build off their interests and do something. We believe that's also really, really good. Second, it gives them something to do to invigorate a love for education. We believe when you love your education, we believe that leads on when you go into college and get your PhD program as well. We believe that love for the academic and hard sciences is something that's really, really important. So what does this lead to when children have a love for sciences? We believe this leads to a lot of things. One, it leads to interest programs in schools, right? The school starts catering to those desires of children and have robotics competitions, space rover competition. We believe all those things are really, really, really beneficial. Also, it leads to economic enrichment programs afterwards, right? We believe people such as Richard Branson, such as Virgin, putting money into the funds, into schools, and helping to raise children to love the sciences, therefore he can employ them at Virgin and send people on tourist flights into outer space. We believe programs such as that, all that's missing is simply a demand from students, a demand from the younger people who has incentive to pursue these things around the national hero. We believe that's also really, 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 really good. I'll take some on this one. Yes.
Are we getting this man back from Mars?
Well, yes. We will be getting this man back to Mars. I'm going to talk about that right now, why this will actually lead to that. If we are able to place a man on Mars, we believe that we will achieve that heroism that we talked about so much before, and distinguish NASA as a really reputable, really wonderful place to work, and a wonderful place to actually do hard sciences once again. Not only because we're putting a man on Mars, but because there's a lot of things that come off of that as well. So what are the impacts of this? We believe, one, it leads to careers and all sorts of other things, right? It's not about just that one single man that we're placing on Mars. It's about all the technologies now that we have to invent to help get that man on Mars, such as the type of spacecraft that we have to go. That employs so many people just to develop a kind of spacecraft that can get that man to Mars, right? We believe a lot of good things come out of NASA, such as, for instance, freeze-dried food is now something that the military uses on occasion. Teflon, which was invented by NASA, is now something that we use in our cooking stoves. And all these other things, such as GPS that was invented by the military, all these things come out of research at NASA for simply one mission that employs so many other different people because it takes so much a group effort to get that man on Mars. We believe all of these technologies to come out of that will help society as well. Another impact is that it helps lead to collaborative industries, right? Such as Sierra Nevada and Lockheed Martin. All of a sudden, these different types of companies will have a further incentive to help get a man on Mars as well. We believe that if we collaborate with other industries around the United States beyond NASA, such as collaborating with Lockheed Martin, we believe that also helps the program as a whole and helps employ people and get them interested in the science because all of a sudden it becomes very, very lucrative to do so. Now, why does this trump deep space exploration? Well, we believe that the understanding of the biological physics of human Earth and technologies that can be used on Earth is a lot more important than seeing how many planets are out there, right? We believe that it is more important because when you can understand Mars and how the atmosphere affects Mars and how man is affected by going on another planet, we understand our own problems as humanity a lot better, right? We understand how our atmosphere works, how our global warming works, and how our body adapts to stuff on Earth. We believe that understanding all of this trumps the simple fact that we're getting that national heroism and all the other things that we wouldn't get if you just simply sent probes out into deep space, because there's not that whole holistic national identity. It's not that exciting when you just have a satellite roaming around Jupiter, right? We've been doing that for years, and we haven't had the love for NASA that we had before. So for all those reasons, because of science, because of interest in children, because of all the technologies and collaboration that come out of that, I strongly urge everyone to propose a motion today. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the esteemed opening speaker for the government. Now we'll turn to the opening speaker for the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the previous speaker's speech, there was a huge problem, and that is he talked a lot about how there are positive impacts of space exploration, but he doesn't necessarily link that to why it's important to send humans uniquely to space. The only example that he gives is that in the 1960s, we had this space exploration which led to an astronaut landing on the moon, which led to more children wanting to get into these types of sciences. But in reality, like, we had the Cold War going on at that period of time, right? Like, we wanted to beat the Russians. We were worried about nuclear threat every single day. At that point, we were more worried about finding a place where we could leave Earth, right, than actually learning about these scientific explorations, which we're more concerned with now. So, as far as what we think is the ultimate value in this round and the ultimate importance, we believe that human knowledge ought to be maximized and that the betterment of humanity ought to be looked for within this round. Now, there are 2 points that I'd like to bring up in order to show this. The first has to do with internalizing external versus internal dichotomies in how we will try to achieve this knowledge. And then the next has to do with the limited resources that we have at this point. So, before I get into that, I'd like to address some of the points brought up by the previous speaker. I've already addressed a bit how the 1960s example of space exploration doesn't really apply. Like, there were different circumstances at hand already that led to more people being interested in space as a whole. They were worried about beating the Russians within the Cold War. It wasn't necessarily just getting a man to the moon. Additionally, even after that, we find that the previous speaker also said that our schools aren't focusing on the right thing. This could shift our schools' focus. And he lists math as one of those examples, but like math is kind of important to getting into space, right? So beyond that, in terms of re-examining how we're going to look at our education, there are other avenues that we can take. We should try to encourage sciences to be taught within schools. We on opposition find nothing wrong with that. We don't think that sending a man to space, though, is in any way going to reinvigorate children to learn. It's actually by changing the school systems itself and reinvesting in the school system itself that we're going to lead to this change. No, thank you. Additionally, there's The previous speaker points out the concept of national hero as well, and that this has ultimately helped with our military exercises. And he listed GPS as an example, but that's a technological advancement, right? That has nothing to do with sending a man to space. We're advocating that we're sending now these unmanned exploration to space, and that's what's going to actually lead to more positive impacts. We have a greater capacity now with our technological advancements to go into space and seek knowledge out in a more efficient way that will help us in the long run. So with that, I'll go into our first point. There's a deep problem with the entire concept of sending a person to space. No, thank you. And one of which is that it is kind of an escapism, right? We're focusing on the external leaving of Earth, right? Rather than internally looking at the problems that we have here on Earth. Once we do that, once we're focused primarily on trying to find another planet or trying to land on another planet and explore Mars as they're proposing, essentially what you're doing is you're no longer focusing on the scientific import of this advancement, but rather you're looking on the external level of, oh, I want to go and visit that place. It's quite similar to sending a person to the beach versus sending a drone to the beach, right? Like when you send a drone or when you send a machine to the beach, there's far more capacity for the machine to be able to analyze the scientific elements and components on that beach. When you send a human to the beach, the only reason you're sending that person is to send a person, right? They want to go to the beach. Likewise, when you send a person to a planet, they're able to garner nothing more than what a robot is or what an unmanned space operation would do. And essentially, you're just spending way more money than is necessary. I'll take that back.
You're ignoring two benefits I stated before. One, by using actually man, you create a heroism that a national identity can identify with. And second, the benefits of going to Mars is that we can help understand ourselves, right, by using comparative.
Sure. As far as the first point, I've already addressed that insofar as we don't have the same context for desiring a hero. Like, we're not fighting the Russians. We're not looking for a hero to beat another country in this respect. Secondly, though, as far as it helping us internalize ourselves, I really don't think that's the case. As I've already brought up, essentially what you're doing is you're sending a person to Mars. That's essentially saying that we can now go to another planet. We don't have to worry as much about our own planet. It's no longer having the focus be on Earth. It's having the focus be on another planet. No, thank you. Now, as far as the limited resources, which is my second point, we already have extreme limited resources in the amount of money we can allocate to space exploration. So there ought to be a balance of our value system here, right? In order to determine which will be more valuable, we have to look to which will be A, more cost effective, and B, will advance knowledge more. When we look to what's more cost effective, ultimately an unmanned operation is far more cost effective. Additionally, there are operations that unmanned space operations can actually take that humans are not able to take. One suggestion is actually to try to get an unmanned space operation to land on an asteroid, and that way be able to determine what minerals and what resources are on asteroids. Because it's already been shown with asteroids that have landed on Earth that there are unique minerals and very valuable minerals that if we can harness will then help us in our own economic development. So we can actually do these types of operations that create an entire industry out of it that in the long run will help us understand ourselves better. So when we look to this round, though, ultimately we're looking to try to find what will help us as humans in the long run. By doing so, we find that by sending a man to space, we're only looking at ourselves. We're not really looking at the science behind it. We're not looking at the value of knowledge. And at the point where you're no longer valuing the sole function of going to space, which is acquiring more knowledge to ultimately help with the betterment of humans on Earth, you're no longer actually posing the right question. Additionally, there are far more resources that we can acquire by sending an unmanned operation to space, and it is also far more cost effective. So for all of these reasons, I urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition. Now we'll turn to the second speaker for government, the Deputy Prime Minister, to continue the government
So ultimately, in the top half of the debate, we've come down to these two main points of contention, right? That we need to look at what is going to bring forth the most knowledge for the humans back home on Earth. Like, how are we going to get this knowledge, and how's it going to be most effective for us, my opinions. And second, we need to look at what's going to be more cost effective, right? Like this started coming out of the last speaker in this speech of what's ultimately going to cost more. So brief rebuttal on this, right? We see that actually most of the time these space probes going out do not come back. They won't come back. There's plenty of things that they run into. There's space junk galore out there. There's asteroids that are unpredictable. There's a whole bunch of space elements, especially within deep space, that are unpredictable. When we put a human life on the line, we definitely calculate this more so than a robot, right? We actually start to calculate these things about how to get this person not just out there safely, but back safely, right? And so with this, the funds will actually be more concentrated into this one area, this one mission, rather than continuously sending out probes over and over and over and just dropping millions like it's nothing because they're just disposable robots, right? And so then we need to look at exactly this knowledge. And they're saying that what they're saying with deep space exploration is that it's going to be the most knowledge for us as humans, right? Well, we already see with deep space exploration, these probes take way longer than sending a man to the moon and back. Like to bring back these resources, to bring back this information that we would need and to send us back this information, right? And we were saying that too, like in order to gain this knowledge and to get the investment behind the science, we need people to realize that NASA is still important because I'm sorry, in the status quo that doesn't exist anymore, people are not seeing the benefits of NASA, of space exploration, and that's why we've continuously seen these cutting in funds. So the way to do that, as my partner was saying, is that we need to revamp this nationalistic pride behind it. Yes, we're not in the Cold War, we're not in the space race, but we're still trying to be on the forefront of science. And what better way to do that than to rally this nationalistic pride behind it, that indeed America is coming up on the top in space exploration, and we're going to be doing this by revamping this ideal of heroism behind it. Because I grew up wanting to be an astronaut, but guess what? That's not an option nowadays, unfortunately, right? So we need to then continuously look at what else was coming out of it, right? They're saying that we're not going to get the funds, but like I just said, we will get the funds as soon as we can actually revamp this, right? Like once we revamp this, we'll see a floodgate into these investments, into this education, and we believe that's inherently good because we believe that science actually can help solve the world's problems, right? And so let me go into what my points of new matter are, right? Is exactly how are we going to get this knowledge, right? How are we going to learn? What world are we going to learn the most in, right? But before I even get into anything...
Isn't it in fact the case that once NASA successfully executed the moon landing, funding declined dramatically in the following decade?
Funding did not actually really decline until we saw the Challenger incident in 1990. And yes, there is a stake of putting your life on the line, but we believe that these individuals are willing to take that risk for the advancement of science, which makes them such unique individual heroes, right? Is because they're willing to step up to the plate and take this. That's why they're heroes in our eyes, right? And so, granted, we did not see that immediate decline, and that actually didn't happen until just the recent decade. So, going off now into my actual substantive point of how we actually need to integrate this knowledge, right? What is actually going to bring us the most benefits, right? So first, with the study of greenhouse gases, right, we see that Mars actually had a completely stabilized environment that completely switched 180 and is now a completely altered state of stabilization. Right? So with this sudden switch in the actual atmospheric science of a planet that's so close to us and in our same galaxy, we can actually step over there and analyze what is going on within this atmospheric system to understand the effects of the greenhouse within our own atmospheric system. Because we see that global warming inherently is a problem within the status quo, right? And we believe this is something that we need to understand. We need to gain knowledge of this. How are we going to gain knowledge of this besides sending someone out there to actually do research on this and bringing them back with samples, with these meteor samples that they were talking about that we need so badly. If we send someone out there, they can grab them, we can bring them back. And so, we believe that having this hand-on exposure to this different atmosphere, to this destabilized environment that was at one time stable, will actually give us the knowledge to understand what course our planet could be taking in regards to this. What these greenhouse gases may be doing to our environment. And we will have individuals there, hands-on, actually learning and evaluating this. And we believe that's inherently good, right? Because that'll actually give us, the general understanding of this shift. But more importantly, right, as my partner mentioned, we have this comparative research that we need to look at. But before I move on.
The reason that research is already happening is because we've already sent someone to Mars to start that research. We think that this comparative analysis you're talking about can be done on any deep space exploration where there are resources that we're looking at that impact us here on Earth.
Actually, we haven't sent someone to Mars, so I don't know. right? We have sent probes out there, yes, and after spending millions and millions of dollars of that, we got some good stuff to look at, right? But we believe that we actually need to understand the human workings within these environments too, within this atmospheric system, and understand, like, you know, the potential that is out there. It's not an escapism route. We're not looking to run away to Mars. We're looking to understand our environment back home and stabilize that, right? And so, like, through this comparative research, we can actually look at, like, the formation of bacteria, right? We can put all of this stuff into these environments. Like, there is frozen pockets of water up there. We can understand both their water system and ours more so we can better preserve our water system, right? We can look at the bacterial infects and, like, the impacts of living in this environment. And, like, understanding this, like, can lead to so much prevention of so many greater things. Like, if we expose it, certain bacteria into this, we might be able to understand, like, the actual nature of the virus itself, which leads to prevention of illness, you know? Like, we saw that, like, there's many incidences in which scientists inject themselves with something to be able to be exposed to this and find a cure, right? And so if we inject something into an environment, we can actually probably find a cure for what's going on in our environment, and, like, with all these bacterial fields, right? And so we see that, like, this can also lead to cross-field discussion, right? Because when you're sending somebody into space, it's not just all engineers building the spaceship, send them out, bring them back, right? We see that there's biologists, meteorologists, environmentalists, everybody is forming together to create this dialogue and discuss, which actually we see greatly increases the benefits. Like, this dialogue just explodes within the science fields to come to a collaborative consensus of what is actually going on. And we see this, like, cross-dialogue within these fields that we believe will actually get the most knowledge on. So what have me and my partner brought forward to you today? First, we brought forward how we need to actually spend our funds within the space program, right? We see currently that the funds are depleting, and we've continuously been using these probes, and we're not getting more funds. But we see that if we put this heroistic pride within an astronaut going out to Mars, that we actually might get the support that we need to continue using a space program, so we can actually have a space program, so our kids can have a space program, and have heroes to look up to within that. And through these funds, and through this, we will see that we'll actually get the most knowledge available, especially going out there and comparing it to our own atmosphere, our own systems, and maybe one day we can actually stop global warming. Thank you.
Thank the esteemed deputy. Now we'll call the esteemed deputy leader.
So here's something that you don't see a lot in debate rounds. I really agree with his positive matter. The problem with it is that it's happening already in the status quo. Everything that he just brought you as far as new material was non-unique. And I'm going to get to that some more in my refutation. And then I'm going to talk about how this ultimately limits our opportunities. And that there are things that are important in space. And that by committing ourselves to a human-based space flight to Mars, the cost of that means that we are limiting what we can actually learn about the universe and ultimately about our own selves and our own origins. But first, some more refutation and rebuilding. He talks about, in sort of attacking my partner's case, he seems to misunderstand what we're saying about space probes. He says, well, the space probes sometimes get, like, hit by something and don't come back, and so that's just a waste of money. Okay, that does happen from time to time. But ultimately, isn't that maybe a reason why we wouldn't want humans on them, right? Space is inherently dangerous. But even more than that, his entire speech seems to forget that radio exists, right? Like, the reason we're able to do research now is that we send out these probes for much less than it would cost to send a human, and receive back information through radio waves, right? And which is awesome. We know a whole bunch about Mars. You can look at, like, maps of Mars on Google Earth, and it's incredible, right? Well, not Google Earth, but you understand. We have all of this knowledge about Mars, and we didn't have to send a human there to get it, right? So the space probes piece is important. But even more than that, he then talks about NASA and how we need this nationalism to pursue science, and that the only way to get kids interested in science is for human spaceflight, right? And it's because we sent a man to the moon in the 60s that kids were interested in science. And then he tells us that he wanted to be an astronaut growing up. And I have to say, for somebody who grew up in the 60s, you've aged remarkably well. The fact is, people are interested in science, are interested in these things, even without the human-based spaceflight that we had in the 60s. That point is also non-unique. Finally, he talks about how knowledge of Mars is important, and he talks about global warming. And again, I'm starting to feel repetitive here, but that's pretty non-unique, right? We're already doing a lot of that research. The only possible reason why we would need to care about how humans interact in Mars is if Ollie is correct, and this is ultimately about escapism and an outward focus, and that's really damaging. I'll take Bob.
Yeah, but the problem Randy, is that when you tie a human to a mission, it actually gives investment and gives people reason to care about the mission. When it's just a drone out there, it gives more incentive for the political capital to be against NASA, not for.
Okay, I mean, so maybe that's their one thing that they have to say, is that it's possible that we'll have more political support for scientific research if it's human-based. I don't think that's I don't think that's necessarily true. I think Ollie brought a lot to you about how the context of space flight was very different in the 60s, and we know that it was different because the support for human-based space flight fell down substantially after the end of the Cold War. We think that matters, and they have to do a lot more to establish that point that somehow putting humans into space is just going to increase our support for space flight substantially, right? They haven't done that yet. So ultimately, what I want to talk to you about today is how this really limits our opportunities. How all of the things that we've heard so far out of the government bench really are important. We do want to learn more about the universe. We do want to learn more about ourselves, and we do want to learn more about how we can interact with our own environment. And one of the ways that we can do that, aside from doing research on Earth, is to explore into space. But the fact is, as Ollie talked to you about, and I'm going to sort of expand a little bit on it, going to Mars is really super duper expensive relative to drones. This whole point that they seem to be wanting to make, that because drones are less expensive, like we don't care as much, I don't know. But the fact is that when going to Mars costs a whole bunch less, for a bunch of reasons. First of all, humans themselves are expensive. We have some basic expectation that we'll be fed and have our needs met. And that is expensive in itself. But even more than that, sending a human into space requires they come back, or they have some way to reproduce indefinitely. That is hugely expensive, right? Unless they're okay with us just sending humans on suicide missions, and I'm not okay with that, right? We can still learn this thing without forcing humans to die. Yeah.
Hence why we want more funds to go into that, so we can invest in those innovations, actually benefit society a little bit more.
Sure, but you're saying we should be prioritizing it over non-human spaceflight, and we don't think that's the case, because we think non-human spaceflight is so much less expensive than human-based spaceflight that we can do much more of it for less money. This knowledge does matter, but opposition is the bench that gives you more of it. Understanding where we come from is essential, and part of how we do that is by sending probes deep, deep into space, further than we could really send human beings, and much, much further than Mars. This helps us to understand the origins of the universe themselves and where we come from, the stardust that we're made of. The technology to go and find this out, to learn these things, is also important, right? And gives you all the same benefits that they want to talk about from the technological revolutions that are required for human-based spaceflight. All of that still happens under the opposition model, but at a lower cost that does not force us to focus outward on other things, but allows us to focus inward on how we can improve life for humans throughout the planet Earth. A small percentage of people might benefit from sending humans to Mars, and those people would probably be pretty stoked about it. But I think we should be focused more on what humans on Earth need, and how we need to live, and the resources that we need. And while they can knock all they want, haven't shown you that. We've made it clear that everything they're saying they get out of their model, you get out of our model, but for much cheaper, which now means, I don't know, we can feed more people. And that's awesome, right? And so it's for these reasons that the points they brought you have largely been non-unique, and to the extent they engaged with Ollie, it was pretty dismissive. And furthermore, that their model decreases our ability to learn about the universe and ultimately about ourselves. And so for that reason alone, aside from the non-uniqueness of their points, it's crucial that we recognize how important it is that we prioritize these things correctly. If we get this answer wrong, we end up spending more money and ultimately wasting resources that could be spent on improving human lives on Earth or building more knowledge. And so for all of these reasons, I urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank Destiny. Now we'll turn to the back half of the debate and welcome the second member of government.
we need to focus on what humans need. That's what the last speaker said. So, how does knowing what's in between solar systems affect how humans live? How does knowing about the origins of the universe affect how humans live, more than knowing how we experience lived planetary existence? We think that's necessary. We think Mars, much more than asteroids in the Kuiper Belt, affect how we live our lives. And we think that that is something missed by side opposition. So that's going to be my extension today. I'm going to talk about reprioritizing the NASA focus, focusing on the future of human expansion and our lived experiences on planets, and about international cooperation. And then, but before I do, I'm going to get on some points of reputation. Robbie brings you some points on like this sort of basically the only thing that comes outside opposition is it limits our opportunity because we could be more effective with sending spaceships, like unmanned spaceships out and satellites out, rather than the human satellites. By the way, I think, as a point of clarification, I think it would be really cool if we had a woman as the first person on Mars, and I think that's something we should anyway. So, limiting opportunity. There's this whole idea that, like, if we go to Mars, we're missing out on all these other things. But what exactly are we missing out? So let's talk about this a little bit. The missions that we send out, a lot of them are gathering data that telescopes themselves sometimes can gather. And sometimes they're doing a little more detailed studies of those things, but a lot of times we don't need to know the details of the moons of Saturn. But what we're talking about on Mars is we're talking about a much more relevant and near experience. So deep space doesn't matter a whole lot, and the origin of the universe aren't as important as it is to know about planetary existence, because that actually affects human lives. Knowing how humans interact with different environments can tell us a lot more about the human condition and about human bodies than it can like knowing about how asteroids move around. And he talks to you about the how space probes are better than humans at a lot of things. But I would bring you a couple points on this. First, it's a lot of detached knowledge. The knowledge and experience of satellites is a lot more of this detached knowledge. It's not about human lived experience. And a lot of what we think is problematic sometimes with the way that science is often brought around is it's not a lived experience. It's not an experience that is about the human body and about human interaction with its environment. And we think we need to bring back a lived experience, a lived interaction. This was what it was like to step foot on Mars. This was what it was like to see a sunset over Olympus Mountains, and what it was like to experience the Mars dirt underneath my feet. That's an experience that invites the people to see the science for what it is, to see the universe for what it is, because we don't live through robots, we live through human shared experience. Before I move on, I'll take a point, top half.
What's the purpose then of sending someone to space, sending someone to have an experience on another planet if you're not entering into this realm of escapism, as far as we already have experiences on Earth?
Great, that leads me perfectly into my extension. Why we need to reprioritize NASA and what necessarily that reprioritization needs to be. Let's talk about the comparative here. We're talking about what NASA currently does, which is send a lot of unmanned space missions deep into outer space, and then it does things like the International Space Station. But we think the International Space Station is a far better use of NASA's time because it's personed. It has people in it. And we think, therefore, personed missions are essential. We think going forth and putting people onto Mars is far better than putting probes onto Mars. And we think that detachment, we need to have less detachment from what we're doing. And we think the space exploration needs to be about two things. First, it needs to be about future human experience and future human colonization. We need to be talking about colonizing space, about the possibility of humans' future of living in space. And secondly, about international cooperation. So first, about human colonization. We think often that human colonization of space is really far from the distance, but actually, technologically speaking, it's not. We're at the point in which we can start to talk about people moving onto space. For example, China has started to talk about a moon base and actually getting people up onto space and living in colony on the moon. We're at a place in which our planet is moving to the capacity of human growth. We're overpopulated in many areas, and we can start talking about moving on. This is not escapism. It's about moving into a new human frontier. It's about expanding what humans can do in the future. We think this is absolutely essential. We think NASA should be about practical things and about moving into these new experiences and moving on and learning how we can actually live and develop colonies onto Mars. But I'll take you back.
That's exactly why we need to explore Europa with probes, because it may have liquid water. No one at NASA believes Mars is a good candidate for this sort of exploration.
Okay, a couple things. One, lots of people think that Mars is a good candidate for this exploration, so it's a lot of time. And two, like Europa is 7-8 years of journey, whereas Mars is 6 months by a spaceship during good seasons of time, and 2 years during long seasons of time. You just have to wait for the right orbits to line up. So it's about 6 months, so it's actually a feasible thing. We actually have the technology to do it. But furthermore, we think that the understanding of how humans can live on Mars can talk about how humans can future live on Mars. We can talk about what it would be like to set up colonies on Mars, what it would be like to live on Mars in the future. We're not talking about in the next 10 years moving billions of people to Mars. We're talking about in the next couple centuries. But that needs to start now. That's what space exploration needs to be about. Just like 500 years ago, although the ethics were a little bit problematic, the exploration of the European people that moved across the world, their exploration was about a lived experience. The thing is, Mars doesn't have other people that we're kicking out of their space. So it means that we can have a place in which humans can expand and humans can grow. We think this is necessary. We think the future development of humans onto these planets is absolutely essential. Otherwise, space is just that. It's just a scientific laboratory with nothing that actually affects human experience. And we need to talk about human experience. But then secondly, let's talk about international cooperation. When you look at international cooperation, it's not through these unmanned space probes that go through space. Rather, it's through human missions. Missions like the International Space Station. The International Space Station is one of the most powerful forces of international cooperation in the world because it brings together all these different nations. For example, the US is using Russian spaceships to get into space. Things that would have been unheard of 20 years ago at the end of the Cold War. We think that's where international cooperation brings countries together. China's talking about manned space missions, human space missions onto the moon. We think this sort of when we send humans into space, we're actually talking about cooperation between different nations. We're talking about bringing the world together. Because unmanned probes tend to be only one nation at a time. But because of the expansiveness of human missions, that means that we're bringing the world together. It means we start talking about global cooperations and global partnerships on these issues that bring countries together on things like space. Because we think space should be the human frontier, not just the United States frontier. And we think that brings everyone together. So we think NASA's shifting prioritization will cause more international involvement. It will cause more countries to get together on these issues and sending a global effort onto Mars, which can possibly lead to a lot more cooperation, a lot less of the sort of like focusing, a lot less of the attention, and a lot more partnership and cooperation, which leads to better international relations, which leads to a better understanding of space itself. So we think that because human colonization is on the frontier, we think that should be the way that NASA should move forward, and that's why uniquely Mars is necessary as the next step. And we think that also because of international cooperation and the sort of international support we will garner by this mission, as opposed to the other spaceships, we proudly propose.
I'd like to thank the esteemed member. Now we'll turn to the second team on the opposition bench and we welcome the response.
It's clear that everyone in this room is concerned about the same thing, Mr. Speaker. We want to preserve space exploration. The debate is how it is most effectively done. What side proposition has only done for you today is give you various reasons why studying Mars is good, not unique to having a man to do that study in that place. What we're about to do for you on closing opposition to show you not only one, is there an opportunity cost in that, but also two, you're better preserving the well-being of mankind when you start with deep space exploration that leads to further man-led explorations into space. To show you why that's true, I'm first going to answer a lot of the claims that were given by the last speaker to prove how fallacious they really were, and then I'm going to go into a point of positive matter, looking at how we're going to better long-term preserve space exploration when the government takes this hardline stance that this is what it's going to prioritize over manned exploration. But first, on answering the claims of the last speaker. So first of all, we get this argument about how NASA needs to reprioritize. Now, the International Space Station is a great example of where NASA needs to be going in the future. We think this is really ironic because NASA's planning on cutting the International Space Station because they found that it's not an effective use of their money to be spending it in that way. So we don't think that their ideal model is actually what's going to make the most impact on the ground. But then also you get this argument about human colonization. Once again, not unique to a man going to Mars. What we see, what are they doing with what they've retrieved from Curiosity? They're trying to simulate Mars on the in the world rather, here on Earth, to see how we can potentially have human colonization, how we can improve water bacteria, how we can do all those things. They're using information obtained by these satellites, by these probes, to study the issue here, back on Earth. So we don't think, A, that's unique to manned space exploration, but also, two, it's not unique to Mars. There's other opportunities for colonization. If you're really that concerned about the well-being of mankind, let's diversify our options for where we can potentially go in the future. That's why my partner's argument about Europa is really important. They actually might have water there. There might be a place that can sustain human life. We think that deep space exploration is actually really imperative and a predecessor to any sort of this human colonization. Then you get this argument about international cooperation. Once again, still not mutually exclusive. It's happening now. They tell you the International Space Station is an example of multiple people being housed there. The European Union Space Agency has 26 countries working together to do space research. So we think that international cooperation already exists. That's not unique to the world of the proposition. which leads me perfectly into my positive matter, because we do need to look at what's unique in this debate and what's unique to deep space exploration, to which there are two things. First of all, we think that when the government finally takes a hardline stance, saying that it's going to support science research that scientific individuals think is really important, is going to impact people, it stops acting on the whims of political individuals, which we think is really important, because all of the language we get from side proposition. If this research is really all that valuable, and it's really going to change the future of not only our continent, but the entire globe, we really think it's important that that money be invested on projects that NASA scientists, those most intimately in the field, think it should be invested in, not what political individuals think it's going to have the most impact on political support. Because then what happens, we continue to have this cycle where we spur excitement for NASA and then it decreases and we have to have this debate yet again. We think it's really important that the government take a hardline stance in which they say scientific research needs to be valued for the objective benefit it has to human society. We think that this sets a precedent for other things such as stem cell research as well, right? That are currently politically debated, that we think have scientific advancements separate from what you believe as a politicalized agent individual. But then there's also a second benefit about how this better preserves long-term space exploration. How does it do this? We think the example of education provided by the top half on proposition helps show this. They give the example of the Virgin director investing in science education privately in schools. We think private investment is really important in today's round. How do you excite private investors about space exploration? You don't show them something they've already seen with Curiosity and with the Mars rover. You show them new things that will excite them to invest in future projects of space exploration that they, as businesses or corporations or private investors, find beneficial to themselves. And before I elaborate on this point about it,
But the thing is, private investors are actually talking about human missions into space, albeit small ones. So we think human missions are the ones that are fueling private.
that's actually not accurate at all. Private investors are talking about things such as going to Europa, seeing the water. They're talking about catching comets in deep space that can be used for mining to get resources to use here on Earth. We don't think that there may be a small minority, that's definitely not the majority, especially when you look at the fact that NASA experts are the ones saying manned exploration is not necessary. This cannot be harped on enough. Please do not listen to 4 college students in a debate room compared to NASA experts that are saying manned space explorations are not necessary, that they're ineffective use as our funds as a state, when they say that there are better external benefits that come to our state from deep space exploration. So what happens when we're diversifying through deep space exploration? We're exciting more private investors to invest more into these different projects. So what happens from that? This is when you actually get the scientific advancements that side proposition wants you to think they have. You actually get them on side opposition. Why is that? Well, when you diversify these options, private investors are investing in new forms of technology. What did the Curiosity rover do? It made advancements in robotics and aeronautics. But guess what? Those advancements have been made because we know how to send that there. We want to make new advancements by sending new probes to new places that we haven't gone, because that's what's going to spur new advancements in optical technology, in radio technology, further advancements in robotics and aeronautics. That's how you actually impact social change. You don't keep investing in symbolic projects that don't actually have an impact on the ground. You invest in projects that have been identified as scientists to benefiting people in the real world. And we think that's really important. And before I continue, go ahead.
Let's just agree that both are really, really, really important, and they both contribute to science in a meaningful way. There are scientists who want to go to Mars, and there are scientists who want to go to deep space exploration. The point is that with man-made missions, you can put a whole entire unification effort behind it, right?
But what happens with that unification effort is that it's temporary. It's only going to last for a certain amount of time, and then we'll have this debate 30 years in the future when people have lost interest in space exploration again. When the government takes a hardline stance that it's going to support research that experts have identified as beneficial, not only for the advancement of technology, but concurrently for the advancement of human society, we think that we fare on that side of that debate, because that's what's going to best preserve the rights of individuals. But then finally, if you do believe in all the benefits of manned space exploration, you still vote for side opposition. Why is that? Because when you secure that private investment for NASA, when you ensure that the government is going to fund NASA despite changes in political winds, what do? You create a stable system that's going to advance the progress that NASA can make. When they can go in deep space, not be concerned about wasting money on unnecessary explorations with men, and they can start to make advancements for new technology, new opportunities that might eventually lead to all of these different manned space explorations. In fact, we think deep space exploration is the predecessor to effective manned space exploration, for the opportunities it offers for advanced technologies, for the opportunities it offers for private investment. And it is because we truly support scientific innovation and scientific progress and societal progress on side opposition we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the member. Now we'll turn to the final speaker, the government bench.
over the many millennia, humans have come up with lots of interesting and creative ideas. They've come up with the idea to go to the moon. They've come up with the idea to give me a cat as a speaking trophy, which might well actually be a real cat, which is beginning to terrify me. But what we think has happened in the status quo is that NASA, in a sense, has had to lose its imagination on the basis of political whims. And despite a lot of the stuff that comes out of the member of opposition, what I think we see as the problem right now is we see that NASA is solely investing in these types of missions that are unhuman, to use non-gendered language, if that's at all possible. What this does is because of the distance created by this, because it's seen as just exploration done through these robots, it makes it that much easier to cut when this budget has to come up on the chopping block. And that's a huge problem. But before I get into some specific refutation of what we heard from the last speaker, I believe there are two key considerations in this round. First, why is Mars more beneficial now? This is the comparative. And then I'll talk about, secondly, what are the benefits to going to Mars instead of emphasizing these other things. First, though, a little bit on the member of opposition. So he talks about how we should have objective benefits to human society. That should be our metric for understanding science. We've given you plenty of benefits. I'll get to those in my substantive material. But moreover, many of NASA scientists actually believe that going to Mars with human exploration will actually provide some benefits. This may sound wacko, but seriously, I got this from NASA. I'm not making this up. NASA is trying to develop the possibility of going onto Mars, which you would have to use human workers to do this, to build something like solar space panels, which will allow for a redivergence of energy from Mars, right? So there is some interest within NASA. It's not like NASA is completely bent on these on robotic drones. And as crazy as that idea sounds, NASA believes in it, and I don't think that's any reason to abandon it if humans are necessary to do it. But then he talks a lot about investors and why, investors are expressing these interests. Well, first of all, investors, which is private money, they can spend their money however they wish. What we're talking about here is public funds. But investors aren't completely emphasizing on these far-off missions into deep space. When the space shuttle program shut down the United States, and it was announced that if you wanted to go into space, you had to go with the Russians, plenty of private investors or people who were very wealthy and apparently, very reckless, wanted to go out into space. They expressed interest. I don't know if anybody signed up, but that interest was there, which means that private investors aren't completely just saying, private investors aren't completely focused on the missions. Like, private investors have their own different motives, and lots of people disagree on these things, but we think that people are still expressing interest in going into space, and we think that's good. So first, why is Mars more beneficial now? Go ahead.
Sir, or Madam Mr. Speaker, do you not find it more logical that when there are more projects going on, there's more diversification for investors to find interest in, as opposed to one project that isolates the entire market?
Okay, well, first of all, private investors can still, again, spend their money how they wish, but if we're showing that we're going to put our political capital into a mission as risky as this, we think that's more likely to draw investors, or a mission as big as this. We think that it's likely to draw investors if it's shown that politicians are actually willing to support people going back into space, and we think that's important. So, what we need to do, as my partner brought to you uniquely, is to reprioritize NASA, because right now the priority is mainly on just sending stuff out and hoping it brings the data back, which doesn't always happen, right? So the current priorities are unmanned probes. And as I mentioned in a POI earlier in the round and at the beginning of my speech, this makes it easier to cut because it's seen as we're not losing human investment in these things. We think that's especially problematic. We think it's bad that NASA's budget keeps getting cut this way. But what the new priorities need to be is human involvement in science. And I mean, this hasn't really been a point in the round, but I think it's important to address. So Ollie gives us this point about escapism, how we're going out into the world. Well, one, we've given plenty of benefits of going to Mars, but like, when my dad goes on vacation, I don't think, no, come back, think of the children. It's like, you could still go out and do things that have meaning to your life, that may be risky, that may take you away from your life for a couple of years, but are still beneficial to society. Human involvement in space is because we precisely think humans have an important role to play in the exploration of space. Human exploration, despite the claims to the contrary on opposition bents, is unique in this regard. He brings up this point, the member of opposition does, that the ISS, was getting its budget cut because it's not seen as a good waste of money, or a good use of money, right? Because they're facing immense political pressure and they're going to have to cut where it's most expensive. We don't want them to have to make that decision. We don't want to have them to just always default to probes. We think that's a bad thing. And then he brings up this point that he talks about the Curiosity rover. Yes, the Curiosity rover has brought us some things, but I would rather not have my view of Mars always look like Cloverfield. That's just me. But I think that we can actually send people to space, and people who have a particular gravity that robots do not, and also have different systems involved than robots do, can actually understand what it's like to be a human on this planet. Because keep in mind, these robots we send out don't have infinite capabilities. They have very specific and limited designs that can only be used for certain purposes. Unlike humans, who have more variability. They're more expensive, yes, but we think that it's an investment that's still that we should be willing to make. And moreover, Mars is beneficial now because human exploration is the trend in international astronomics right now. Because what we have is things like the International Space Station, which we don't think on our side of the house should be cut. We have seen nations coming together in these fields. And we think that this is another thing that my partner brought to you uniquely, is that we can improve this if we show that the United States has the desire to send someone to space. And we think that that will benefit these projects on the whole. But lastly, what are the benefits? And we think there are four we'd like to isolate. First is the very important one that top government brought to you, which is the ecological benefits. Things like global warming, understanding the atmospheric nature of the planet in relation to ours. Secondly, however, and this is another thing my partner brought to you, is greater human understanding. Because we are, as much as we are, Earthlings, we still play a role in the solar system. And if that planet's gravity is affecting ours, or if there are other ways that we might branch out to that planet, we think that it's beneficial for humans uniquely to be there, not just robots who have limited capacities. Thirdly, is colonization. And I don't want to sound like a futurist here, like I'm not being crazy, right? But we think that there is a legitimate chance that we could use these planets, not necessarily to live on like we do Earth, although that is possible. We could use them for things like the solar panel example that I brought in earlier. And the only way to do that is to put investment in at some point. And we think that that some point could very well be right now, in as far as we see that these missions aren't keeping NASA's budget alive. If anything, they're making it worse. Lastly, though, and this is another unique thing that we brought to you on Second Government, is international cooperation. Things like the International Space Station, things like nations coming together and people from different universities in different countries trying to figure out how to get back into space, how to best effectively utilize the moon, for instance. We think these are important things, and we think that they show that putting capital toward Mars right now is a unique benefit that these the probes that we're sending out into space aren't giving us. So, we think that Mars is uniquely beneficial right now. It's risky, yes. It's going to be more expensive. We've never denied that on our bench. But we think the unique benefits that it provides in allowing for greater international cooperation, for allowing unique human understanding, not a robot possible digital alteration of what a human might experience, is much better than what we're doing in the status quo, and as such, I propose.
I'd like to thank the final speaker for the government bench, and now we'll hold the final speaker.
Everyone ready? There are two things that tend to get lost in debate rounds that we need to refocus on. The first thing we need to refocus on is the motion that we are debating. And the second thing we need to refocus on is reality. Because I think as the government has advanced their case, both of these elements have been taken out of this round. So first, reality. What we need to keep in mind in debate is there's a tendency to talk about the general. We get suckered into these large issues about the human experience or preventing global warming or understanding other planets. And when we do this, when we focus only on the general, we lose the grasp of the specific, about what it is we are actually talking about. Because what is actually happening? We are putting a guy in a spacesuit to walk around on Mars. He doesn't have any instruments he wouldn't have in a probe. He doesn't have the ability to telepathically communicate his experience to everyone else on the planet. He's one guy operating instruments. And it's this failure to realize the reality of the situation that critically undermines the argumentation out of the proposition. Because if we look at what they're saying, the idea that we're going to solve global warming by experimenting on Mars, there's nothing a probe can't do that a guy in a spacesuit can do. And furthermore, probes get better. We can develop further technology in what a probe can do with its research that simply isn't the case for an individual. When we talk about the human experience, no one in this room is against human space exploration. We're against dropping everything and putting all of NASA's resources into sending a guy to Mars right now. We can have that human experience in the future once technology is further developed. We just deny that we should drop everything and do it now. And that's the second thing they don't realize. The third thing they don't realize is the idea of putting all our eggs in one basket. Because that is a diversification my partner talked about and that they ignore straight down the government bench. If Mars fails, if a human is killed on their trip to Mars, if we fail to get someone back, because those are all real risks, NASA is done. They would have put all of their resources in this one-shot mission, it would have failed, and all of their advantages disappear because of the catastrophic failure. That is what my partner talked about with diversification. If a probe fails, there are other probes. NASA isn't done. This is a catastrophic failure they admitted happened with Challenger. If there is a second Challenger, if there's a Martian Challenger, it's game over for NASA, and that's a diversification we need to avoid.
So that's the issue of reality, the lack of contact with reality that we see on their side of the house. Top half.
So you're saying we should never go out to space because it's dangerous?
No, that's absolutely not what I said. In fact, I explicitly said we can have manned exploration in the future. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't drop everything and put everything into one trip to Mars right now. There's a critical distinction there. The second thing I want to talk about is the motion. Because the motion here isn't, we should only do unmanned space exploration. The motion is we should reprioritize space exploration on Mars. And this is the second critical point we need to keep in mind. Because what we recognize on closing opposition is we need to be concerned with the long run. We need to be concerned with policies that will best promote space exploration in the future. If we have a national hero, maybe there'll be some rally around the flag. Maybe a national hero will temporarily increase interest in space exploration, but maybe it won't. Maybe that will fade. Maybe the mission will fail. What we need to ensure long-run space exploration is to recognize, as they have stated on the government bench, that public financing is inherently risky. The future of space exploration is the private sector. It's driving private investors to invest in space. And yes, there's some interest in short-range space tourism. There's things like SpaceX, which want to put a man into space in low Earth orbit. But that isn't the core of private investment. Real private investment is about other places. It's about capturing comets. It's about exploring the moons of Jupiter and Neptune. And that is what we need to promote. But private investors cannot make the initial investment to explore those places. This is what my partner told you that they ignored. It is only agencies like NASA which can do that exploration. And once NASA identifies that there are resources on comets and moons that investors are interested in, those investors will invest in space, and we don't need to worry about cuts to public funding because private funding will support space exploration. So this debate is ultimately not a debate about private and about manned missions versus unmanned missions. That's a false dichotomy that's been perpetuated in this round. Bottom.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious, but to the extent that we're not forcing these investors to do anything, and they're so hell-bent on using it on the money in the ways that you say, why not just let them do that?
Thank you. I get your point. What I told you is that we need to identify the opportunities for it. An investor can't afford to spend $1 billion sending a probe to Jupiter's moons, but once they know the resources are there, then they're willing to go there. We see the same thing in their example of the New World. Spain had to finance the initial trip to the New World, but once the economic opportunities were identified, then there was a flow of private investment. The same thing happens in space. So this is the false dichotomy in this round. And this is why, at the end of the day, the only coherent vote is an opposition sweep. Because what we see is that we are not debating unmanned space exploration versus manned space exploration. We're debating sanity versus madness. On the side of madness, we drop everything. We put all of our eggs in one basket. We don't diversify. We don't support private investment. We take the risk that the whole mission fails and then the entire space program collapses. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and if it doesn't, it's game over. And then there's a side of sanity that's been advocated by the opposition bench, where we don't cut spending on manned space exploration. We don't abandon it entirely. We use it as part of a coherent package. We diversify. We do the kind of exploration that's necessary to support private investment. Because when you have private investors and when you have diversification, you can capture their benefits. You can support scientific education. You can build a culture of space exploration. You can support space development much better than a one-shot failed mission ever could. So at the end of the day, this debate comes down to ultimately a single question. Do we risk everything on a mission that could fail, that has no concrete benefits, that won't enhance the human experience, and it puts the entire future of human space exploration at risk? Or do we side with sanity? Go with the side that's been advocated by scientists and experts, that NASA currently supports, and preserves space exploration for the future. It's because I strongly believe, and we all strongly believe, in the future of space exploration, that I strongly urge you to vote with the opposition. Thank you.